Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Crystal Dory, and I'm the Communications Manager for KMK. As you all know, we're still in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic, and with that, we can't do in-person meetings as much as we want to, but we recognize how important it is to still inform community members on the work of our organization, and that is why we have decided to move our community sessions virtual. So this is our second virtual community session. Hopefully you were able to catch the last one. If not, at least to watch the recording. Last month we featured our archaeology department. And this month we are featuring our MIKMAQ cultural tourism department. Shannon Monk is a member of the KMKNO team. She joined us in April 2020 and will be providing a presentation tonight. She is our MIKMAQ cultural tourism project manager. So if you weren't aware or you didn't see it, we also have a newsletter that accompanies each month's presentation. It is posted on our website and is sent out to our email distribution list. If you want to be on that list because you didn't receive the newsletter, you can go to www.mikmawrights.com and fill out the contact form there and send a message in, and we'll add you to our distribution list. Or you can email us at info@mikmawrights.com. Before I turn it over to Shannon, just so everyone knows, there will be a question and answer period after Shannon's presentation. And there, depending on the device you joined in, there's either a button right down below or up at the top where you can send in your question, and we will ask the questions to Shannon at the end of her presentation. And if you're watching this as a later recording and you have questions that weren't answered in this session, you can email them to us and we will pass them along to Shannon. And I know Shannon will be more than happy to email you back and respond to your questions that way. So without further ado, I will turn the virtual podium over to Shannon and let her start her presentation.
Yay, hooray. It's always nice when technology works. So thank you so much. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that we are in MIKMAQ, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I wanted to let you know that I am actually hosting from East Pepeswick in Musquodoboit Harbor. And I thought you might be interested to know that Musquodoboit is, of course, a Mi'kmaq word meaning where the foam rolls in. And Pepeswick means the river eddies in the rapids. And it certainly speaks to the fact that all across Nova Scotia, we do have traditional territories with our traditional names, and how wonderful when we can embrace that and get to know the meanings and the stories behind our traditional territories and their names. I'd also like to acknowledge this beautiful painting that was done by Loretta Gould. Many of you will be familiar with her work from MIKMAQ, and I thought the beautiful Mother Earth painting was a wonderful way to begin, in a good way, to bring our hearts, our minds, our bodies, and our spirits together in prayer. And so I'd like to begin by sharing a prayer with you that was actually inspired by the words of Rita Jo. And Rita Jo, of course, is one of our sisters, a Mi'kmaq poet. And this prayer also is inspired by the Anishinaabe and the Anishinaabe medicine wheel teachings, and also the Haudenosaunee words that come before all else. So today we give thanks for the gift of being together by acknowledging and thanking the mysteries of creation. We live in spiritual harmony through the wisdom gained from the minds of old and revived in the trails left for the young. The path is still in existence, and we practice it with respect and gratitude. We bring greetings and thanksgiving to the people, to our mother, the earth, to all the waters of earth and life that resides within, to all plant life and medicines, and to the foods that sustain us. We bring greetings and thanksgiving to all insect life and four-legged beings and bird life. We bring greetings and thanksgiving to the winds, the thunders, stars and skies, to our grandmother, the moon, grandfather, sun, and to the creator of all things. And if I have forgotten anything, I ask that you give thanks for this too, so that we might bring our hearts, our minds, our bodies, and our spirits together in unity as one. Msit Nogama. I also wanted to acknowledge that today is Pink Shirt Day, and a very important day that began in Nova Scotia to address anti-bullying. And so in that spirit, I wore my pink today, and happy to see the work that we're all doing to advance this really important issue forward. So I thought I might share a little bit about who I am. I know that many of you know me and many of you don't. And so I wanted to share this, this collage of my life, at least a snapshot of my life, to share some of the different places that I've been and the different things that I've done that have brought me to this beautiful place and this beautiful position to be able to work in cultural tourism. So I want to introduce myself in my traditional way in order to begin that process. Waje sanintene pakanjane indigenakad, medinigaming egumina migamagi in donjaba, maingan egumina megaze in totem. So what I said to you was my name, but what you heard was the name in Oji Cree, which was She Opens the Door, my traditional name, She Opens the Door. And I said that my roots are Mi'kmaq from Lennox Island on my mom's side and Celtic on my dad's side from the eastern shore of Nova Scotia. And I'm also a member of St. Teresa Point First Nation, a fly-in northern community in northern Manitoba. And I said that I walk with the Wolf Clan, and I'm also a sister to the Eagle Clan. And I wanted to share that with you because, you know, when I think about my history and the road that I have taken and the red road that I am walking, authenticity is such an interesting topic of conversation because even though my mom was Mi'kmaq, she ended up growing up in Manitoba. And so we have, you know, we're very much influenced by the Oji Cree, which is the language that you heard in the Oji Cree teachings. Although it's really exciting and interesting to see the overlap in so many of those teachings with Mi'kmaq teachings. I spent over 10 years on the reserve in northern Manitoba in St. Teresa Point. And so I have that, that lived experience of living that isolated life on reserve. And I've also lived in rural areas and I've lived in urban areas. So I lived in the valley in Nova Scotia here for about 8 years when my children were in their late childhood, early tweens, and early teens. I lived in Toronto for a couple of years, didn't like that at all, so ended up going to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories and worked in cultural education for a number of years. So I supported teachers and schools to integrate, not Mi'kmaq, but Dene perspectives into the classrooms. And my background is as a teacher. So when I lived in St. Teresa, I was also teaching and doing education. And so that education, that cultural education, then led into some work that I did with the Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa for 6 years, working in policies and politics. So learning the policy side of things after being, you know, grassroots and on the ground and in communities. And it really helped me to marry the importance of those cultural teachings with advocacy work and really advancing nationhood. And so I moved here to Nova Scotia about 2 years ago, and just really happy to be reconnecting with family and roots. So that, yeah, I'll just leave that there. And I'll move on to what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to talk about tourism, but more specifically, we're going to focus on cultural tourism. And what does cultural tourism mean? We're going to talk about authenticity and the importance of protecting cultural knowledge and cultural wisdom and preserving the language, and how there is a natural overlap between that protection and that ability to preserve. We've been working on authenticity specifically and have been drafting some guidelines. So I'll talk a little bit about that experience as well as the Spirit of the MIKMAQ brand. And we'll be also talking about our community engagement and next steps. So many of you will know, of course, that tourism is one of the largest economic drivers in Nova Scotia, but what we also know is that definitely Mi'kmaq are not visible in tourism in a really significant way. We have little pockets of visibility, but you know, as an example, if you arrive in the airport in Halifax, you don't see that this is our traditional territory. And so one of the drivers for this is to really create more visibility. And it ties in nicely because there is a huge amount of interest right now globally in Indigenous culture and tourism. And so not only are people across the country interested, but also we have international markets that are really desiring to have those authentic experiences, cultural tourism experiences. So these products and services are gaining recognition across the country, and we have pockets of cultural tourism, you know, for example, in BC and Ontario, where we have a fairly well-developed system for cultural tourism. People have been involved in it for a lot longer than we have. And that's creating an appetite. And so people are looking to the rest of Canada, and here we are ready to dive right in and really build a beautiful infrastructure. Once we have authenticity guidelines in place, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, it will really help to support our economic development and social development, of course, by attracting more visitors and interest. So we'll get the financial impact, but we'll also be creating awareness, which is so critical, of course, in this era of reconciliation. Understanding too that certainly, you know, as Crystal alluded to, we've really been impacted by COVID, and you know, cultural tourism is essentially on pause. But we're arguing that this is the best time possible for us to be working on this, so that we can have a really strong foundation once our markets open up. And again, as I mentioned, cultural tourism is really critical for the revitalization of language and culture, which is at a critical mass right now, not only here in Nova Scotia, but across the country. So when we look at defining cultural tourism, it's defined as a category of tourism focused on a traveler's engagement with a country or a region's culture, and specifically the lifestyle of the people in that area, their history, their art, their architecture, their religion, and other elements that help to shape their way of life. And I like this quote that comes from a number of different studies that have been done on cultural tourism. There is an opportunity to attract far more visitors to the region for whom a culturally and environmentally authentic experience is worth almost any price. Visitors want local, and in Nova Scotia, of course, it doesn't get any more local than Mi'kmaq. And so we really want to look at ways that we can capitalize on the huge, huge, huge financial opportunity that tourism provides and offers. When we think about cultural tourism, it's different from tourism in that, as I mentioned with that definition, we're looking for that cultural component. So we're looking for that flavor of being able to share stories, to share traditions, to share the language, the culture. And so some different examples of that include just sitting with an elder and listening to stories, or a storyteller. It doesn't have to necessarily be an elder. Hosting learning circles to share a little bit maybe about the history of the people or any elements of the people. Cultural performances, powwows, Maui-omis, outdoor adventures. Outdoor adventures is a really big one because there is a huge interest right now in tourism for people that are interested in being outdoors and exploring the geography of an area. And so when we marry that cultural element and they get to learn about traditional territories and geographical aspects of the area that they're exploring, then it just enhances and provides that value added piece. Cultural displays and exhibits, of course, have been the more traditional ways that culture has been shared for many years, mostly in a museum context, maybe in a cultural center context, but we can really look to expand that. Food and sharing traditional foods are ways to really enhance tourism, cultural tourism opportunities. People are really excited and interested to have a hands-on experience where they're tasting and they're smelling and they're doing. So if we can engage the senses, then that's going to create a memorable experience for the visitor. And different arts and crafts workshops. You know, certainly the Mi'kmaq are known for so many different types of crafts, whether it's our beautiful baskets and the diversity of baskets that we see across the land, the wooden flowers, different types of jewelry making, the clothing. I mean, there are just so many opportunities. When I think about cultural tourism, I think about on the land activities and different ways that we engage with the land, and those become opportunities to provide those experiences for tourists. So it might be, well, as you can see in the picture, fishing, right? So a different element, having a fish fry out on the land, or taking someone out in the boat and sharing the stories that are attached to those experiences. Perhaps it's going out into the bush and doing a medicine walk and talking about the different types of traditional medicines, or you know, dancing, right? Gojwa. So sharing what we do. And as we start thinking about the different opportunities that we have to share these, we really want to ensure that when we are talking about cultural tourism, that we are putting an authentic lens on it and ensuring that it is Mi'kmaq controlled and Mi'kmaq created. So I want to talk a little bit about what has led up to these conversations around authenticity. But I wanted to acknowledge that certainly we have cultural tourism entities already that exist here in Nova Scotia. And so as an example, we have Eskasoni Cultural Journeys, the Membertou Heritage Park, the Mi'kmaq Heritage and Cultural Center in Bear River, the Millbrook Cultural Center, the Wamukuk Culture and Heritage Center, and of course, the work that's being done right now with Mi'kmaq de Burt. So we have and it's important to kind of separate these two so that people understand that when we're talking about cultural tourism, it's all encompassing. So we've got the nation-owned entities, but then there are also many businesses and community entrepreneurs that are doing work in cultural tourism as well. And so again, as examples, Alan Sillaboy and Loretta Gould, who are really well-known artists. Gerald Bernard owns Glooscap Ridge Campground. Morgan Toney, who is involved with music. Twin Bees Creation and their beaded jewelry. And as a matter of fact, the picture that you see here is, these were created by Vivi Gugu. And it just speaks again to the wealth of information that we already have. And we're looking at a way to support a cohesive approach moving forward so that everyone is supported and everyone is protected. So in addition to those cultural tourism entities and entrepreneurs, we also have a number of organizations that are working to advocate on behalf of cultural tourism and to support that. So at the local level, we have NSATEN, which is the Nova Scotia Indigenous Tourism Enterprise Network, and many of you may know some of the members. Robert Bernard's involved, Kathy Martin's involved, Daryl Bernard's involved, and they developed this network to support the growth of cultural tourism business. And they focus more on the community side and the community development aspect. Whereas the work that we're doing right now, which I'll get into, is focused more on right now on the governance side of things. And so NSATAN will be really focused on ensuring that, that entrepreneurs know where they can go to access funding and to access training. And we'll be looking to develop workshops and training opportunities that will help to enhance capacity, specifically in cultural tourism. In 2020, just this year, a study was conducted that explored what's happening with Indigenous tourism across the Atlantic. And it was a really important and powerful study because it really identified where there are strengths in cultural tourism and where there are opportunities. And certainly we know that funding is a huge challenge, and building capacity is really important. And by looking at it from an Atlantic or a regional perspective, we're looking to build networks so that we can support one another as we all move forward to build a more vibrant cultural tourism sector, not only in Nova Scotia, but across the entire region. Nationally, we have the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada, who, and they support Indigenous tourism at a national level. They've been involved for a number of years and have developed national standards and national guidelines. So they provide kind of that foundational framework. But from a Nova Scotia perspective, we want to take that good work that's been done, and we really want to ensure that the guidelines that are being developed have a MIKMAQ strong focus, a MIKMAQ focus on governance and ensuring that we are in control of what's happening with cultural tourism and able to make the decisions. So while those advocacy efforts were going on with those different entities, work has been happening from a governance perspective. The Tripartite Forum Economic Development Working Group was established a number of years ago, and also the Cultural and Heritage Working Group and the MIKMAQ Cultural Tourism Network. And so those entities were working to advance cultural tourism, and in 2015, a strategic plan was developed that was focused specifically on culture, heritage, and archaeology. And it was really fantastic because it really laid a really strong foundation for all of those areas, but specifically it helped to identify some key areas of priority for cultural tourism. So that led into, in 2018, the development of the cultural tourism strategy for the Nova Scotia MIKMAQ, which of course was supported and endorsed by the Assembly. In 2017 and 2018, there were a number of different engagement sessions where people were invited to come and share their thoughts and ideas around cultural tourism. And in 2019, we had the approval of the cultural tourism strategy along with the implementation plan. And so when we talk about cultural tourism, it has been a while in the making. It didn't just pop up out of nowhere. There has been a lot of concentrated effort and a lot of really passionate people. And those passionate people are still helping me, thank goodness, today. You know, they comprise, many of them are on the advisory committee, which I'll be sharing with you in a few minutes. And so we're able to provide that consistency and that passion and that commitment for ensuring that we continue to move forward. So the strategy itself is comprised of a 5-year plan. And within that, there is a focus on 4 priority areas or 4 pillars. So we have, sorry, excuse me 1 second. The MIKMAQ leadership and governance is one of the pillars. And of course, it's engaging our MIKMAQ chiefs and councils, the communities and tourism sectors and governments to facilitate the sustainable tourism growth. So to ensure that communities know what's going on, that communities are on board, that communities have a voice, and that everyone knows that we are moving forward and taking control of our cultural knowledge. The authenticity pillar is basically to grow and strengthen the spaces and resources we have to create and recreate our own stories, guided and informed by our own expertise and experience. So ensuring that the Mi'kmaq stories that are being shared within the cultural tourism sector are stories that we have endorsed, that we've approved, that are coming from us, not from some outside entities that are interpreting or in many cases making up our stories and calling it their own. The third pillar is Mi'kmaq-led development. So ensuring that we have long-term strategic investments and a focus on development to really create our own products and to create our own services so that we're building that capacity and so that we can be really competitive within not only a national but an international market. And then finally, marketing. So really, how do we bring those visitors in? Right? All the different elements that go into marketing to ensure that visitors can participate in Mi'kmaq cultural experiences and buy our products. So the first year was focused on setting up the organization and developing our core, starting to create some networks and to build some partnerships, and especially to focus on the authenticity guidelines. And again, noting that COVID has had a huge impact on that. Now within the first year, we started the process of developing the authenticity guidelines, and we do have a draft. And to get to that draft, our deliverables were to ensure that we engaged with communities. So we talked with elders, knowledge keepers, community leaders, artisans, crafters, and tourism operators so that we could get feedback and input in order to create this foundation of what authenticity means. And we wanted to ensure that as we were having these discussions, that we were talking about Mi'kmaq songs and dances and traditional stories and talking about the history and traditional images and other cultural ceremonies and practices, because we wanted to get a sense of what people wanted and what people didn't want to share with visitors. We also focused on bringing in some branding, and I'll talk about that again in a few minutes. I wanted to draw your attention to, so you may notice on some of these slides that I'm using different Mi'kmaq images. And I found this Mi'kmaq image, and you'll notice that it says Awasos Silver, and it's copyrighted. And that really intrigued me. And so I researched the company because I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, Awasos is actually an Anishinaabe word meaning child. And there's also another word that can be used from that word, Awasosos, that means bear. And I thought, well, what's the Anishinaabe doing with the Mi'kmaq image? So I found out that this company was actually registered in New Hampshire. There's no website. All that was registered was that technical information that you need to register a company. And when I was trying to look for a website or to look for other images that it was associated with, they actually are known for developing wallpaper and different kinds of print items. And they also have different Indigenous artwork that they use, that they've copyrighted. I saw some Eastern woodland images, and I thought, so this is exactly potentially, and I don't know this, but this is potentially what we're talking about in terms of appropriation of the culture. So who is this company? Are they Mi'kmaq, or have they just capitalized on all of these different images? So if someone has the answer to that question, that would be wonderful. But those are some of the things that I was thinking about when I saw this image. We have a cultural tourism advisory committee, and they are just a godsend. They are such wonderful, wonderful humans that are just really passionate and guiding this process forward. Our lead chief is Chief Wilbert Marshall, and our board chair, or not board chair, but our committee chair is Tim Bernard from CMM. We have a number of funders that sit on our advisory. So from ISC and from Tourism Nova Scotia and from ACOA. And then we have a representative from the Union of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq. Then we have ITAC represented, and we have INSITEN represented, and of course KMKNO. So those names, in case you are reading through them: Tim Bernard, Blake Robichaud, Kathy Martin, Heather Ewell, Mike Rothenberg, Richard Young, Buddy Young, I guess, Robert Bernard, Tanya Johnson McVicker, myself, Shannon Monk. And I just wanted to give a shout out also to Tracy Menge, who was the former co-chair from Eskazoni, and she was really a wonderful support and advocate in this process. So as I mentioned, we were developing the authenticity guidelines, and we conducted a series of interviews, over 20, almost 25 interviews with people, and we focused on a number of different areas. We wanted to define authenticity. You know, how do we know when something is authentically Mi'kmaq? What does it mean? We wanted to look at Mi'kmaq content. You know, what are some of the stories and experiences that we could share with the public? And how do we balance tradition and cultural evolution? And that was an interesting discussion. Mi'kmaq ceremonies, how does this fit within tourism? And which ceremonies should we share, and which ceremonies can't be shared with the public? How do we compensate elders for their knowledge and wisdom? And there was a lot of discussion about compensation and what that could look like, and how that should be enacted. When we're talking about authenticity guidelines, who does it apply to? Is it the nation entities, or is it just the entrepreneurs? And finally, in terms of communication, how do we support tourism operators to understand these authenticity guidelines, and how do we communicate this to visitors? So it led to some really, really interesting conversations. We engaged the services of Jeff Ward, who I'm sure everyone who's listening tonight knows from, of course, member to Heritage Park, and the services of Group ATN to conduct these interviews. And so I'm not going to read through this whole list, but suffice it to say that we had some really outstanding knowledge keepers and elders who just brought a depth and breadth that was just absolutely astonishing, from across Mi'kmaq, or I guess I should say across Nova Scotia, so from one end to the other. And this is only the beginning. We're just starting to have these conversations, but it was super exciting, and they really helped us to develop a really strong foundation for sharing with you all, which we'll be doing very, very soon. From there, once we started the interviews, we pulled together a cultural tourism authenticity working group. And so they're taking the draft, and they're helping to continue to refine and provide feedback and ensure that we're moving this forward and reflecting authenticity in its best way possible. So the members of our working group right now: Daryl Bernard from Glooscap, Don McEwen from Bear River, Debbie Dykstra from Pictou Landing, and I should say Daryl Bernard from Glooscap, but actually from member 2, so Glooscap Bridge. Melanie Purdy from Acadia, Brennan Gugu from Millbrook, and Tahira Paul from Bodladek. And we actually have a meeting on March 23rd where we're going to be going through the guidelines with a fine-tooth comb and just making it better and better and better. And then we'll be sharing it with community. So in terms of the guidelines themselves, we heard so many incredible things. So I want to share some of the key findings. First and foremost, it's that this is a really hard task. Authenticity is really, really difficult to define. And many people say, well, you know, sometimes I can't really articulate what it means or how to say it, but I know it when I see it. At the heart, everyone agreed that the transparency and openness about a story or product's origin is really, really important, and to be able to connect that story or origin to Mi'kmaq history and tradition. Pretty much everyone said that tourism is an important way to celebrate Mi'kmaq language and culture, but how it's done is something that really needs to be discussed. There was consensus that we need to be very mindful of the diversity that exists across the province, and everyone has their own stories and their own perspectives, and that we need to respect those perspectives. But at the heart of everything, it's not Mi'kmaq cultural tourism if Mi'kmaq aren't involved. If it's someone else that's not connected with the Mi'kmaq who's telling those stories, then it's not authentic. Again, ceremonies were okay to share if it was a community type ceremony. So, you know, dancing or feasting or Mawiomi. But people were really clear that sacred ceremonies should not be shared with tourists. For example, you know, a sweat lodge or a naming ceremony. But even within that, there was some really interesting discussion about levels of readiness and what you can share even in terms of ceremony if people are ready. But that led into a lot of discussion around monetizing ceremony, and such an interesting and ongoing conversation. And I'm sure everyone else who's listening tonight has an opinion about how we ensure that our elders and knowledge keepers are compensated, but how we don't commercialize ceremony and monetize it so that it becomes, you know, we don't want a Las Vegas style cultural tourism experience. So that traditional and cultural knowledge really needs to be valued, and only Mi'kmaq who are knowledgeable and experienced should be offering these teachings. Guidelines should be uniform for both on reserve and off reserve. Again, Mi'kmaq community members should be creating, controlling, and delivering. And a Mi'kmaq brand would ensure that tourists know that the product or experience is authentic. And so that's really interesting. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm going to have to hurry. Within the authenticity guidelines, we identified some mandatory requirements. And so those were specifically around Mi'kmaq ownership and control and development and endorsement of cultural content and values. And then a series of recommended protocols, and that was more related to service delivery and communication and community support, cultural integrity, authentic experiences, and pricing. We also know that there are so many other things that we didn't even get to when we started this first round of conversations regarding authenticity. But we want to make sure that we have the Mi'kmaq language infused throughout, Mi'kmaq concepts and values. And also we wanted to address the whole notion of collaborations. And so if you have Mi'kmaq and non-Mi'kmaq entities working together, how do you define that authenticity? And that led into another discussion about what about engagement protocols with non-Mi'kmaq tourism ventures. And if someone is starting up a tourism venture that isn't Mi'kmaq, how do they engage with Mi'kmaq to invite that possibility and that possible collaboration? And then finally, how do we regulate and enforce authenticity? So many questions. We were introduced to the spirit of the MIKMAQ brand, which of course many people will have seen. This was developed in 2008. And when we were talking about branding and bringing or developing a logo to authenticate these experiences and products, the consensus was, why reinvent the wheel? So we have the spirit of the MIKMAQ that we are now revitalizing, and we'll be bringing that to the community to talk about a certification process for authenticity. So in terms of next steps, we had a resolution from the Assembly in January. So they are supporting the authenticity guidelines and supporting the spirit of the MIKMAQ logo to share with community. So our next step is to bring it to you all. And so we'll be getting feedback from you all. And we're hoping to create a survey very soon, in addition to some community visits. So we'll be looking at things like the content, the governance, the partnerships, the capacity, and developing a database. And so many things to do, so many things that we've done, but it's super, super exciting, and there's a lot of enthusiasm. So I'm seeing that we have our lovely Crystal, who is giving me the signal that it is time, but guess what? Last slide. And I've already talked about that, so we are good.
Oh, Shannon, if you wanted to do that last slide, absolutely. I was just getting prepped for some questions for you. So if you do have a couple more minutes, if you want to go back and do that.
Well, I talked about this, and it was really more around the regulatory and enforcement pieces. You know, some of the questions that we have for ourselves moving forward is just, you know, what happens when somebody doesn't meet those guidelines? So what kind of enforcement mechanisms do we have in place? What are the approvals process? You know, does someone have to apply to be authentic? So who has the responsibility for communicating those guidelines? So these are just some of the questions that we have as we're moving forward and we start to engage with community.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shannon. So if we can just stop the screen sharing on that. Can you do that on?
Yes, I think.
I don't know if I can. Technology, it's fun.
I'll stop the share. Oh, look, stop share. There we
go.
Perfect.
So we did get a couple questions while you were talking, and we got a thank you. A thank you, Shannon, from Tracy Menge, who is watching, and she appreciated the shout out when you were talking about the committee.
Wonderful.
So the questions, I'm just going to bring up the screen here. And I think you might have started to allude to this a little bit, but just to, you know, help clarify and answer for people, is there a process or a board in place for governing our MIKMAQ tourism industry in Nova Scotia? And who says a MIKMAQ tourism experience is in fact MIKMAQ? Yes.
Well, there is no board yet. When we're talking about who decides what and who is MIKMAQ and what the experiences are and how we authenticate or certify. Our first step is to have the authenticity guidelines, and the authenticity guidelines will be a series of recommendations around, well, as I mentioned, there's a checklist where we've identified the mandatory protocols to ensure that it's created by MIKMAQ, you know, that the source and the origin is MIKMAQ, and that there is some sort of certification process with communities. There always has to be a link back to communities. What we don't know yet is what that looks like, but we do know that we cannot, you know, somebody coming in from, you know, who grew up in Ontario and, you know, has the Anishinaabe teachings can't come in and be certified as MIKMAQ because they tell a MIKMAQ story, right? But then someone might argue, well, what if they're collaborating with the MIKMAQ community and there's a collaboration and a partnership? Possibly. So it really depends. And this is why we need to develop the guidelines to have a discussion point to move forward so that we can hear from community members about what they want and what that potential board or that entity, that governance body looks like.
Yeah, I think you definitely highlighted the importance of that. And I think that, any Mi'kmaq could definitely understand that. Before I ask the next question, because I didn't even think to do this, for anyone who joined us a little bit late and does have a question for Shannon, depending on the device you joined in on, there's either a Q&A or a question button somewhere's down the bottom or somewhere's up in this top right corner. So you can type in your questions and send it to us, and I can ask it to Shannon during this section. So the next question we have, Shannon, is, I have an idea to make money from my cultural knowledge and traditions. How do I make sure that I'm not going to get in trouble for setting up my business?
Mm-hmm. Well, what we want to do is create a mechanism where people are going to build their confidence because we can direct them accordingly. So again, going back to the authenticity guidelines, we will have kind of a step-by-step process that's laid out for people. And again, as I mentioned with answering the first question, it's always going to be about community, and different communities will have different mechanisms in place. For example, some communities will want their chiefs and councils to make the final decisions. Some will have an entity, a cultural entity, and that entity may be in charge of making those final decisions or supporting businesses and entities to develop. There may be an elders council within a community that is responsible for that, or an elders and cultural advisory. Like, it's going to be different. And we don't know yet what those mechanisms will be. We don't know if the 13 communities all want their own separate authenticity or authentication process, or whether there will be an umbrella organization. We can't assume what that mechanism or what that entity looks like, but anyone who's considering starting a business, this is about creating awareness that as we move forward, there are going to be systems in place. And so if you are thinking of starting a business, it's really important to make sure that you're connected with community and part of the process of developing what this could look like.
Perfect. Thank you. We have another question, which I think I'm just going to tweak a little bit. The question is, I'm thinking about running a Mi'kmaq cultural experiences tour company. What sites and experiences are available now to include on my tours? But I was thinking, how would one know or be able to find out what sites and experiences are available?
Yeah, so this is one of the gaps that we've definitely seen, and we've been talking with Develop Nova Scotia about how to create more visibility. And while we're talking about creating awareness, on the KMKNO website, that doesn't yet house kind of all of the cultural tourism experiences and products that exist out there. We've been working with NCTEN to work on a process to develop a website so that we have one-stop shopping for people that are looking for Mi'kmaq cultural tourism, so that we have all of those resources and all of those supports in place that will help people, because different people, of course, are doing different things. And we also don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we really believe in partnerships, and that means looking at what Develop Nova Scotia has and what the Tourism Industry Association of Canada has and what the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada has, and the workshops that NCTEN is developing and the stuff that Ulnaweg is doing. And we want to be able to pull all of that together and give people concrete ideas and suggestions. And I will say that, I started my own company a couple of years ago, consulting company. And when I started my business, I really got the runaround from a lot of people where, people were saying, oh, you can do this and you can do this. But all I did was get shuffled from one website to another website to another website. But there wasn't any real tangible hand-holding. And nobody actually sat down and told me, this is what you have to do, step 1, step 2, step 3. And I know Robert, as a businessman, and Kathy Martin, who are involved with Robert as the regional Atlantic representative for ITAC, and Kathy as the chair for NCTEN. We've all had those experiences. And so we know that we want to create a mechanism that is not about shuffling people from one website to another, but actually helping people step by step to build a vibrant cultural tourism business that's going to benefit individuals, communities, and visitors.
Great, thank you. And just to help anybody out who is new to this and doesn't really know a lot about tourism, can you tell us what the INSATEN, and I don't even remember the acronym for the one that Robert Bernard works for.
Okay, so INSATEN, which of course is the Mi'kmaq word for to understand or to listen, to understand, which I think is a wonderful acronym. It stands for the Nova Scotia Indigenous Tourism Enterprise Network. And ITAC is the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada. And so they have a national office, but we have Robert as the Atlantic representative.
Wonderful, thank you. That's very helpful. I think you answered this already, but one of the questions here is, will the guidelines be self-managed by those offering cultural tourism experiences, or will it be tied to an approval process? What entity will be responsible for this? I know you said that, there's still some discussion around this, but I thought I'd ask the question because it's there, in case you had anything to further explain on that.
I do, because it's interesting. So at the national level, as I mentioned, the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada does have national guidelines, and those are self-managed. So those are just ideas that people can take and run with if they're so inclined. It's kind of a suggestion of best practices. And so that's what we mean by self-managed. But my sense is, from the feedback that we've heard already, is that people, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia, don't want them to be self-managed. They want to have some sort of a regulatory body or some sort of an enforcement process. And I think that's fair, because we know that in this era of reconciliation, we still have a lot of lip service to authentic collaboration with Indigenous people across Canada. And certainly that's the Mi'kmaq experience as well, right? People are talking the talk, but they're not necessarily walking the walk. And so we want to be able to make sure that people are doing things in a good way that fits within our understanding of our own governance and our own rights. And I know that our chiefs are really passionate about stepping up to the plate and not rolling over anymore the way that maybe we've done for many years in the past. And by we, I mean Indigenous people from across the country. And, we're ready to take a stand. And this is one of the ways that we can do that, especially because we're talking about the integrity and the protection of our cultural knowledge. And it's such a foundation for who we are. Culture and language is identity. And if we don't have our culture and we don't have our language, then we don't have that sense of who we are. And so we really need to take the steps that it takes to ensure that we protect and we reclaim and we preserve and we advance this so that we are in control of our own destiny.
Love that. We know that we have some amazing cultural experiences and people already working in the Mi'kmaq cultural tourism industry. And a question has come forward that has asked, will somebody be working with our cultural tourism partners and our Mi'kmaq cultural tourism places to help them adopt the guidelines and to communicate the guidelines to them?
Yes, and that's a great question. We're still in the development phase of the authenticity guidelines themselves. And, I want to say that it would be nice to do things in tandem, but right now we have an office of one, and that's me. So there's only so much that we can do. But once we get these authenticity guidelines in place, we do have some funding partners that are really interested in moving this whole project forward. So The short answer is yes, but we may not be able to communicate those guidelines quite yet. We're still in the creating awareness and creating the guidelines process, but definitely, definitely there will be a mechanism in place to ensure that everyone is aware, that we create that awareness.
And I assume that that mechanism or a similar mechanism will also be in place to help those who are tourism partners in the non-Indigenous communities here in Nova Scotia as well.
That's right. That's right. You know, like we had an example of an organization that right now is using a Mi'kmaq name as part of their business, and they're not affiliated with any Mi'kmaq, but you know, what we've heard, they just think it's a cool name, right? And so there's been questions about how do we have those conversations? And it's not to go in with the hammer, but it's, we have to start creating awareness about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, because we've been appropriated for so long, you know, that people don't even think about it. They just do it. And so our role is to gently guide and then put the hammer down when we need to. But we want to begin, you know, I think about our peace and friendship treaties. You know, we've always been known as people who want to build relationships. And so that's the approach that I've heard repeatedly from the elders, that we want to approach this from a peace and friendship perspective, but it doesn't mean that we aren't willing to be hardliners if we have to. But let's start off with just trying to create more awareness.
And I think that that answer actually lends itself really well to our last question of the evening that I have here. And it is a brave question, and one that I'm really glad that we got. It is, how can non-Mi'kmaq take part in cultural tourism without appropriating Mi'kmaq culture? How can non-Mi'kmaq show respect for cultural experiences and sites? And I guess leading off from that, is there a way to find out what the do's and don'ts are before going into one of these events or activities?
Well, you know, awareness is so important, and there are different resources that we have across the province that can create awareness about who Mi'kmaq are and where they live and what their cultural history is, you know, from different communities. Reaching out to MK as an example, and reaching out to treaty education just to get some foundational knowledge. But specific to cultural tourism, again, that's why we're building the cultural tourism guidelines. And part of what we're hoping to provide, and I mentioned that towards the latter part of my presentation, was just engagement protocols so that we can start to build these collaborations. And this is honestly, as a result of the authenticity guidelines, and even starting to talk about this in the general public. You know, we've been approached by a number of different entities now, with Peggy's Cove and with the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and a few other entities where people want to engage, to start to have these conversations so that they can do things respectfully. And that's a huge shift from these entities just going ahead and doing their own things and then looking at the Mi'kmaq as an afterthought. So there is an interest, but it's building those muscles and building that cultural confidence.
And I think it's worth saying that, you know, the Mi'kmaq are here to share, and we want to help share and to educate. And I know, having worked in the tourism industry in the past myself, we received lots of questions from everybody, and I always say that if the questions come from a place of genuine wanting to learn, wanting to be educated, wanting to be informed, we never take offense to the question, because we want to help educate and we want to help share that knowledge. So,
and yeah, and just to build on that, so one of the things that wasn't identified for this year, but one of the things that we do want to build is kind of a Mi'kmaq 101 toolkit, if you will, right? That speaks specifically to what are the foundational elements of what it means to be Mi'kmaq. And Hawaii actually has an incredible toolkit, an authenticity toolkit, where they have created a bunch of content in addition to their do's and don'ts. And so it's a package of both, right? Where you get the content and you get the do's and don'ts so that people have a foundation to work from. So I loved that toolkit, and I'm really hoping that we can build a Mi'kmaq version of that type of resource.
That would be very, very exciting and fantastic. And I hope that it's something that comes to fruition down the road. With that, it looks like we are out of time for the night, but I know, Shannon, you wanted to end this evening for us in a very special way. So I will let you take over and close the evening. And I thank everybody for attending. I hope that you will join us again for our next session, which will take place on March 31st, and same time, 6:30 p.m. And we'll hope to make it the hour as well. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shannon. And I look forward to your closing.
Thank you. And thanks so much for your help today, Crystal. I just want to do a quick song, and I'm just going to do one round. This song is a song that one of my elders gifted me with and asked me to share. And it's a song about cultural reclamation and pride for our children and our future generations. And if you want a longer description of what this song is about, I can certainly share it with you, but I'm just going to sing one round for you to so that we can leave in a good way and close. Hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure to spend time with you, and I look forward to seeing you all in your communities so that you can share with me everything that you want about authenticity and cultural tourism. Take care, have a great night, and I hope to see you soon. Lalin.